Money Vikings, Money Viking G here. Welcome back to the show. And I think I got a real good one for you today. Very interesting topic. We're going to talk about retiring off of Bitcoin, but I'm going to do it in a sort of broad, macro sort of sense. I'm going to do it in terms of the way the world is changing. I think we can all feel it. I think we can all actually see it. It's going to be one of those times where we look back on this era and are going to be sort of blown away by how quickly and how rapid things seem to be changing. And I think we've definitely been feeling that over the last couple of years, maybe ever since AI really went mainstream and the pandemic and all that. Maybe that's when things really started accelerating and getting a little crazy in the world. Well, the world's always been a little bit crazy, but there just seems to be a lot changing very rapidly now. And I am firmly of the belief that a certain percentage of Bitcoin in one's portfolio is going to be critical going forward. And I will explain all the reasons why. But let me start with kind of a macro sort of vision or view of how things stand at the moment. The world is a bit in turmoil and a little bit in chaos. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's individual world is like that. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings, where there might be a lot of sort of big shifts, power shifts going on in the world and in the realm, but you have the hobbits kind of living their individual lives, which are just great and fine, and they just get to live out their lives. But there is a time when there's that knock on the door. Gandalf shows up in your town and he discovers that there's a ring of power sort of sitting there in the Shire. It's a little bit of a funny, funky metaphor, but I just thought it'd be kind of fun to throw that one out there. But the idea is that we are all kind of living our individual lives. But at the same time, I think we all know that on the very near horizon are some major changes in the way we work, the way we live, the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with economies, the way we interact as global citizens, the way we interact online, the way we interact and connect with technology or not. There will probably be sort of a fragmentation in the world. There will be those who rightly so, are going to try and manage technology, push back on it a bit, because it is a bit overwhelming for our monkey brains, right, to be so connected in this world of technology that is just ever growing faster and faster. But we can see also the turmoil in the world. The world order of nation states is a little bit becoming disrupted. Unfortunately, there's many countries run by very egocentric, very myopic, self-centered people, powers that be. And those countries are there's wars in Ukraine, and there's problems in Gaza and in the Middle East. There's places in the world that are quite peaceful as well. It's not all doom and gloom, but there's sort of a reshuffling of things. And a lot of that usually has to do with balance of power, the struggle for power, and the struggle for resources, right? So there's a lot of that going on. And on a macro level, there's a couple of big themes going on. We're going to see continued disruption from climate events that are existential threats to everyone, really, and it will affect everyone's life in some way. And then there's major sort of disruptions happening to the investing in the financial world. And we're obviously primarily a personal finance channel for middle-class wealth builders, so that tends to be my focus. And so that gets me back to Bitcoin. So with Bitcoin, it has such potential, as we know, and I'm definitely of that camp that's predicting it to rise dramatically in value over the next several years. There's many reasons for that. I saw a statistic recently. 30-year-olds are at an all-time low in owning homes, in getting married, and having children. And that's a major problem for a society. It's basically a huge demographic problem, a huge demographic cliff that we are about to fall off of. You need younger people to keep the economy going. They are the ones that are family forming. They are the consumers. So you need different segments of the economy. You need workers and consumers, and you need investors and those with capital that are investing into the system. Typically, those with capital who are investing are the older folks who are living off of their investments and their retirements. But you need that block of young people making children, basically, and then consuming and working. It's a whole wheel. It's a whole cycle. That appears to be breaking down in some ways. So again, that brings me back to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the huge advantage of Bitcoin, as we all know, is that there are only 21 million that will ever be made. And that's actually quite misleading, because there will never be 21 million available. There's 8-9 billion people on the planet. And I would say there's estimates that 6 to 7 million of the Bitcoin have been actually lost forever. So, that right away brings you down to something like 14 or 15 million Bitcoin. Beyond that, there's companies like MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor who say that they will never sell Bitcoin. So basically, when he passes away, the keys to his Bitcoin will basically self-destruct like Mission Impossible. And those will actually be trapped and locked in stone, or, locked in diamonds for eternity, and however many that is. And there's a few situations like that. More will be lost over time as well. So let's say at the end of the day, there's only really going to be, it actually hasn't all been mined either. 19.5 million maybe has been mined. I think it stops mining in the next 20, 30 years. But now very little's being made up until that 21 million cap. So you have this digital gold, you have this store of value. It can also be used as a currency. So you can see that there's quite a bit of utility. And the power of it is beyond that, I think. The power of it is that it goes beyond nation states. So we have all lived in the modern world order of nation states. So each country is supposed to value and protect the sovereignty of another country. So we don't meddle directly in the affairs of Germany or India or others, and then others are not supposed to meddle in our affairs. We know the world's a little messier than that. Of course, there is sabotage, and there's been terrorism, and there's economic warfare. There's hot warfare. So there's ways that countries compete and try to meddle with each other, and kind of those that they deem or see as their quote-unquote enemy, they try to push down. All of this on a major pullback view is quite silly. I mean, we're all part of humanity on one small planet in the middle of the universe, or not in the middle of the universe, but somewhere in the universe. And this is our only planet we know of thus far that can support life like it does, as beautiful as it is. And so we're not being very wise about how we are being stewards of this planet, actually, in many ways. So the bottom line is that traditional assets all have a lot of problems. Bitcoin isn't perfect either, but I do believe that it is part of a strategic portfolio of assets going forward for those that are, I'm Gen X, but especially for those that are younger, I really think that there has to be a place for Bitcoin in a portfolio. Bonds have really not done much at all, generally speaking. And if you take into account inflation and how bad that's been, and I really don't see it getting better, I really don't. How does inflation get better, right? And you have to lower demand maybe, and then you have to also increase supply. I don't know, with the way the world is right now, and the tariffs and the trade wars and all that, are we going to be able to see a situation where inflation comes down? I just don't know. I don't see it. You know, we're trying to remanufacture in the United States. That's a very long process. It usually takes many years. So we're going to see how all this plays out. So at the end of the day, Bitcoin is definitely going to be part of my strategic portfolio. I'm going to grow the percentage, sort of exposure to that over time. And I've shifted my thinking of late. I'm not thinking of it as quote unquote a traditional investment. I'm thinking of it as a savings account. And I'm thinking of it as another form of currency to own, and one that's going to retain its value over time and grow in value over time. I do subscribe to Michael Saylor's view that you're probably looking at 33% return annually. So another strength about Bitcoin, so we all know that we need to acquire assets in order to have any kind of comfortable life or retire. Otherwise, we're dependent on some huge system, or we're dependent on the government, or we're dependent on charity. But in order to be truly independent, we need to have the ownership and control of assets that can sustain us and our families. And so that's why I think Bitcoin is one of them. But something interesting is happening lately with Bitcoin. I think it's less volatile to, things like China banning it, because I've always thought this about Bitcoin. Another thing about the power of Bitcoin is that it needs no one. It is code. It's code that's locked in and incorruptible. You cannot print more of it. You cannot manipulate it yet. You cannot change it. It is code. And when it was set, it was set. And it's completely transparent and it's fair. And I think that's what draws people to it more and more. How is it fair that you work your whole life in some country? Let's just use a fictitious country. You work your whole life in a fictitious country to have the power of your savings diminished by 40, 50, 60%, more in some places, as they just print more money. The politicians will print more money, more and more. It's just not right. So Bitcoin, I think, does solve that problem. It's a world currency. I think that's interesting to keep in mind. So it's something that anyone around the world and everyone in every country seems to own Bitcoin now. That is very odd and very rare in the world. I don't know if that's ever happened before. I guess you could say the dollar had a certain amount of hegemony for many years, and you could say maybe historically the British pound as the world's reserve currency, and the US dollar is still a reserve currency, but maybe someday Bitcoin becomes the reserve currency. We don't know. It's very interesting. We're definitely going to have some kind of hybrid system for a while, and that's just the reality of it. But again, if you're interested in retiring in the next 5 years, I would certainly say that Bitcoin is part of it. Now, none of this is financial advice. I'm only sharing what I'm doing as a way to help middle-class wealth builders build wealth and be as resilient, as strong as possible, because the more of us that are strong and healthy, the healthier you are and the stronger you are as a society. So hey, thanks for watching. See you on the next one. Like and subscribe and do all that great stuff if you don't mind as we grow the channel, and take care.